I have stood the night watch in the long gallery of Harrowgate Palace for 6 winters now, and in all that time I had never once seen Corwin Hale sit down. So when I rounded the corner past the amber stair on the last night of the old year and found him lowered onto the stone bench beneath the portrait of the third Harrowgate king, one gloved hand pressed flat against his own chest, I thought, for one cold and certain instant, that I was watching a man die. "Sergeant," I said, my voice came out wrong, too high for the gallery's hush. "Sergeant Hale." He lifted his head. The lamplight caught the deep lines of his face, the white at his temples, the gray that had crept into a mustache that had been iron black in the recruiting photograph still hung in the guardroom. He was 61 years old. He had served the royal house of Harrowgate for 39 of them, and the men of my generation spoke of him the way you speak of a cathedral, something you assumed had always been there and always would be, something you did not imagine could fall. "Easy, Bran," he said. "I am only resting my legs. An old man is allowed his legs." But his breath was short, and his hand stayed where it was, and his eyes, this is the part I could not explain to myself for weeks afterward, his eyes were not on me. They were on the far end of the gallery, on the tall double doors that led to the royal apartments, where behind a foot of oak and a sleeping household the Queen of Eldermoor and her 2 children lay dreaming. He watched those doors the way a sentry watches a tree line. He watched them the way you watch a thing that has tried before to come through. I had been a king's guard for 6 years. I thought I understood what the watch was. I thought it was standing still in a cold corridor while the realm slept, so that the realm could sleep. I did not yet understand that for one man among us, the watch had never once in 20 years been still. "Let me call the surgeon," I said. "You will do no such thing." He said it quietly, but it was the voice that had drilled 3 intakes of recruits, and my hand came off the call bell as if the brass had burned me. "Sit with me a moment. That is an order, guardsman, and you may tell anyone who asks that I gave it." So I sat. The bench was cold through the wool of my trousers. The palace breathed around us, the tick of the long case clock at the stairhead, the settling of old timber, the wind finding the casements it always found. Somewhere below, the river ran black past the Watergate. And Corwin Hale, who in 6 years had never told me a single thing about himself that was not a correction of my own conduct, began, in the last hours of that old year, to talk. "Do you know," he said, "what the worst posting in this palace is? The young men always guess the river gate. The cold off the water, the long dark, the wet stone. It is not the river gate." He turned his head, and the lamplight ran along the medals on his breast, campaign ribbons most of the young men could no longer read. "The worst posting is the one where nothing ever happens, where you stand 20 years and not one soul ever knows that anything was prevented, because a thing prevented leaves no mark, Bran. A fire put out is a story. A fire that never caught is nothing at all. No one thanks you. No one can. They do not know there was a fire." I did not understand him. I told him so. He smiled then, a real one, brief and tired, and I realized I had perhaps never seen him smile before. "No," he said, "you wouldn't. I have spent 20 years making certain that no one would. That was the whole of the work." He looked back at the doors. "Let me tell you about a winter 20 years ago, and a thing I noticed that I was never meant to notice, and you will decide for yourself after whether an old man kept faith or only kept a secret. I have never told it. I find tonight that I would rather it not die with me. And that is how I, Bran Aldous, third watch guardsman of Harrowgate Palace, came to hold a story that the realm did not know it owed. I am setting it down as he told it, in the plain order he told it, because I think the order matters, because the way a man comes to a thing tells you as much as the thing itself. He spoke until the long case clock struck 3, and then he stood slowly and squared the line of his tunic, and walked back to his post as though nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. I only did not know it yet. He began, as old soldiers do, with a small thing. "It was the 2nd winter of Queen Saralyn's reign," he said. She was young then, younger than the burden she carried. Her father had died in the autumn, and the crown had come to her sooner than anyone wished, and the realm watched her the way a crowd watches a tightrope, half in love and half in fear of the fall. The prince consort, Aldrich, was newly her husband. The children were not yet born. And I was 41 years old, a sergeant of the Queen's bodyguard, and I believed, God help me, that I had already seen the whole shape of my service, that nothing remained but to grow old at my post and be retired with a good pension and a fair name. He paused. I was wrong about that. I noticed the seating chart. I waited, the clock ticked. There was to be a winter ball, he went on. The first great gathering of the new reign, every house of standing in Eldermoor, the foreign envoys, the old families, the new money. A test of the young queen's court as much as a celebration. The seneschal's office prepared the seating for the long table, and a copy came down to the guardroom as it always does, so that we would know who sits where and which faces belong to which names. A dull document. I had read 100 of them. I read this one over my supper, and I noticed, and I cannot to this day tell you why my eye caught it, except that 30 years of standing still teaches a man to see what does not fit. I noticed that the place card for a certain understeward of the household had been changed, moved, from the far end of the hall where the junior staff are seated, to a position 6 chairs from the Queen herself. A clerk made a mistake, I said. That is precisely what everyone said, Corwin Hale answered, when I very quietly asked. A clerk made a mistake. The chart was corrected. The understeward was returned to the far end. And the matter was closed, and I was thanked for my diligence in the dry way they thank a guard for noticing a thing above his station, and I should, by every rule of sense, have forgotten it. He looked at me. I did not forget it, because I had also noticed, and this I told no one, because there was nothing yet to tell, that the understeward in question had joined the household only 4 months before, with a letter of character from a county family that, when I later took the trouble to write to them, had never heard his name. The clock at the stairhead ticked into the silence between us. I found that I had stopped feeling the cold of the bench. A false letter, I said. A false letter, he agreed, which is a small crime and a large one depending on what it buys you. It bought this man a place in the household of the Queen of Eldermoor, and someone with access to the seneschal's office, someone with a clerk's pen or a clerk's friendship, had tried once to buy him a seat near her person, and had been stopped, not by any vigilance of the court, but by the chance that a 41-year-old sergeant read his supper-time documents too closely. You reported it, I said. You must have reported it. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, had gone careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is laying down, stone by stone, the foundation of a thing he has carried alone for a very long time and is not certain will bear another's weight. I went to my captain, he said. Captain Marrow, a good man, dead these 11 years, may he rest. I told him what I had found, the changed seat, the false letter. He listened. He was not a fool, and he did exactly what a good captain should do. He took it to the steward of the household, who took it to the chamberlain, and an inquiry was made. The understeward was questioned. He had an answer for everything. The letter, he said, was a confusion of 2 families of the same name. The county family was found to be mistaken, or to have forgotten, or to be protecting their own honor. The seating change was a clerk's slip, as everyone had already agreed. There was no crime that anyone could lay a finger on, and the man was, what is the word the chamberlain used? Rehabilitated, cleared. Returned to his duties, with an apology for the trouble. And you let it go, I said. I do not know why I said it as an accusation. I think I wanted him to have failed so that the weight of what was coming would be smaller. I let it go, he said, in every way that the world could see. I made no further report. I spoke of it to no one. I performed my duties without a flaw, and I let the inquiry close, and I let the household forget, and I let myself be, in the eyes of every man above me, the slightly overzealous sergeant who had cried wolf over a seating chart and been gently corrected. He turned his head and looked at me full on, and in the lamplight his eyes were very steady. And every single day from that winter forward, I watched that man. I learned his face the way you learn a scar on your own hand. I learned his hours, his habits, the staff he favored and the ones he avoided, the rooms he had caused to enter and the ones he did not. I learned which deliveries he signed for and which he did not, which letters left the palace under his hand. I made of myself, in the one corner of my mind that no inspection could reach, a record, a ledger, of one man. And I told no one I was keeping it, because the moment I told someone was the moment it became a sergeant's grudge against a cleared man, and I would have been moved or retired or simply not believed, and then no one would be watching him at all. I understood then the thing he had said at the beginning: a fire that never caught is nothing at all. For how long? I asked. Corwin Hale looked back down the gallery at the doors to the royal apartments. He is still in this palace, Bran, he said. He has risen in 20 years as patient men rise. He is no longer an understeward. And he told me the name, and I will not set it down yet, because I want you to feel the way I felt it, the floor of the world tilting very slightly under a name I had nodded to 100 times in the corridors, a name I had thought belonged to one of the most trusted men in the household of the Queen. I did not sleep that night after he sent me back to my post. I stood in the cold and watched the doors as he had watched them, and for the first time in 6 years I understood that the stillness of a king's guard is not emptiness. It is attention. It is a man holding a thing up so that it does not fall, and the holding looks from the outside exactly like a man standing still. I want to go back now and tell it as he told it to me across that first night and the nights that followed, for he did not give it all at once, and I would not have him give it to you all at once either. He gave it the way the years gave it to him. A thing noticed, then a long waiting, then a thing noticed again, the pattern surfacing slowly across 2 decades the way a wreck surfaces slowly from a draining lake. To understand what those 20 years cost him, you have to walk them at something near the pace he walked them. So, the second winter of the reign, a sergeant with a ledger no one knew he kept. In a household that had decided with relief that nothing was wrong. The first year, he said, taught him patience, because the first year nothing happened at all. That is the hardest year, he told me. You have seen a thing. You are certain of it here. He touched his chest, and the world has told you that you are wrong, and the man you are watching does nothing day after day to prove you right. He does his work well. He is courteous. He is liked. And you begin to wonder whether you have made a madness for yourself, whether you have built a villain out of a clerk's error and your own pride at having noticed it. There were months that first year, Bran, when I would have given a great deal to be proven a fool. To find him plainly innocent so that I could put the ledger down and sleep. A guilty man would have been a relief. It was the doubt that wore me thin. What kept you watching? The letter, he said simply. The false letter of character never went away. Everything else could be explained. A man who lies his way into a royal household does not do it to polish silver. He does it because he is placed there. And a placed man waits for the day he is wanted. So I waited too. I told myself, I will watch until he proves me wrong or proves me right, and I will not hurry either one because the only thing my hurry can do is warn him. He let out a slow breath. That is the discipline they do not teach you on the parade square. To do nothing correctly for years. The first sign came in the 3rd year, and it came, as the worst things do, dressed as good fortune. Princess Malin was born that spring, Corwin Hale said. And for a moment the careful soldier's voice gave way to something warmer, something an old man cannot keep out of his voice when he speaks of a child he has watched grow. You should have seen the palace, Bran. I have served 3 coronations and 2 state funerals, and I have never seen this house so glad as it was the morning that bell rang for the Queen's daughter. The prince consort wept on the steps in front of half the court and was not ashamed of it. Strangers embraced in the forecourt. And I stood my post, and I was glad too, And then I saw the understeward in the crowd of household staff gathered to cheer, and I saw his face, and I have never forgotten it because his face was glad in exactly the way that everyone else's was, and not 1 degree more or less. He had practiced. A man who feels nothing learns to wear the feeling of the room. I had been watching him 2 years by then, and that was the morning I knew, past all doubt, that I had not made a madness. Because no honest man rehearses his joy. "That isn't proof," I said. "No, it is not proof. It is a guard's certainty, which is worth nothing in an inquiry and everything to the man who must decide where to stand." He shifted on the bench. But the proof came too, that year, in its small way. The household was enlarged for the nursery, wet nurses, attendants, a physician for the princess, new guards on the nursery floor, a great hiring, and the understeward, who had charge by then of part of the household's correspondence, was well placed to recommend names. He recommended 3. I noted all 3. 2 were ordinary servants who served well and grew old here, and I came to know them as friends. The 3rd was a woman engaged as an undernurse, and she lasted 4 months, and she left without notice in the night. And a week after she was gone, a sealed letter was found to have been taken from the Queen's private cabinet. A letter of no great consequence, as it happened, a matter of an estate, and it was never recovered, and the loss was put down to carelessness, and the woman's flight, and no one connected the woman to the man who had recommended her, because no one but I was keeping a list. The cold of the gallery seemed to deepen. I thought of the nursery floor, of the guards who stood there now, of how easily a wrong face could be made to belong. "You said nothing." I added it to the ledger. His jaw tightened. "Understand me, Bran. I want you to understand the trap of it, because you will stand a watch of your own one day and you may find yourself in it. I had a man I could not prove was guilty, who had now done a thing I could not prove he had done, by a hand I could not prove he had placed. If I spoke, I would say all of that could not, and I would be the overzealous sergeant again, only worse, because now it would look like an obsession. And the moment I was named an obsessive, 2 things would happen. They would move me from any post near the family to protect the family from me, and he would know, at last, that he was watched. I would have spent my own usefulness and bought the realm nothing. So I did the hardest thing a soldier can do, which is to swallow a true alarm and stay silent and keep watching, and to live with the knowledge that if I had guessed wrong about my own silence, the cost would not fall on me. It would fall on a child in a nursery." He was quiet a long moment. "I aged 10 years in that 3rd year," he said. I had a wife then, a leaner, gone now. My wife told me I had begun to talk in my sleep. She never knew what I said. I made sure of it, but I knew. I was standing my watch even there. There is no posting, Bran, like the one inside your own head, and no relief from it. I did not know he had been married. In 6 years he had never once spoken of a wife. I see now that this was of a piece with everything, that a man who has trained himself to leave no trace of his deepest work leaves, in the end, very little trace of himself at all. That is the price the story does not put on the medals. He went on. The 4th year and the 5th, he said, were years of small confirmations and no crises, and they were in some ways the worst, because the absence of disaster is the easiest thing in the world to mistake for safety. The understeward rose. He was made steward of the 2nd household, a real promotion, a place of trust, charge of accounts and stores and the comings and goings of 100 staff. The men above Corwin Hale thought it well deserved. Corwin Hale thought it exactly what a patient enemy would want. Not to strike, but to climb, because the higher you climb in a great house, the more invisible your hands become, and the more doors open to you without your ever having to force one. I learned in those years what he was not, Hale told me. He was not a thief for money. What he took for the taking of it, for the use it might be later, never to sell. He was not a man of passions. I never once saw him angry or drunk or careless. He was not working alone. There was always at the edges a letter that left, a visitor at the trade gate who did not give a right name, a sum in the 2nd household's accounts that balanced too neatly. but I could never see the hand at the other end of him. That was the thing that kept me awake more than any other. I could watch my one man until I knew the set of his shoulders in the dark, but a placed man is only the near end of a long arm, and I could not see the shoulder the arm grew from. I did not know whom he served. I only knew it was not the Queen. "Did you never think of going to her?" I asked. "To Queen Saralind herself, past the Chamberlain, past all of them?" He looked at me, and there was something almost like grief in it. "Every year," he said. "Every single year I thought of it. She is a good woman, Bran, you know this, you have stood near her, you have seen how she is with the staff, with her children, with the realm. A better sovereign than this house has had in 100 years, and I do not say that lightly." There were nights I rehearsed it. I would request a private audience, I would lay it all before her, the seat and the letter and the undernurse and the missing letter and 20 pages of a watch she did not know was kept. And then I would imagine her face. Because here is the thing about a good ruler, the thing that makes them good and makes them vulnerable both. They want to believe in the people around them. They have to. A sovereign who suspects every face cannot rule. She would go mad, or become a tyrant, and Saralind would sooner die than become either. If I laid my certainty before her and she believed me, I would poison her trust in her own household, perhaps forever, on the word of one guard's ledger. And if she did not believe me, if she did what any sensible person would do, and took it to her chamberlain to look into, then it would reach him. The very man it concerned would be set to investigate himself. You see the shape of the box. "You were the only safe place to keep it," I said slowly. "You, just you." "I was the only place it could not leak from," he said, "because I was the only one who could not afford to be believed." He stood then, the first night, and squared his tunic, and that was where he left it. He had given me the shape of the thing but not its heart, and I went back to my post with my head full of seating charts and false letters, and a steward of the second household, whose name I now could not hear in the corridors without a coldness moving through me. I told no one. I had caught the disease of him, you see, the disease of the silent watch. Once you know a thing that cannot be proved, you become its keeper whether you choose it or not. He took up the telling again 3 nights later on the 2nd of the new year, when the watch threw us together once more in the long gallery. He did not preamble. He sat on the same bench, as though the story lived there, and he had only come back to where he had set it down. "The 6th year," he said, "is where it stopped being a matter of watching and became a matter of doing, because in the 6th year Prince Joran was born. I knew the prince. Everyone in the palace knew the prince, a grave, kind boy of 10 now, who said good morning to the guards by name and once, when he was small, had brought a guardsman a cup of water on a hot day in the forecourt because he had decided, with a child's certainty, that the man must be thirsty inside all that wool. To hear that Corwin Hale's story now reached toward him made my hands cold on my rifle. "An heir," Hale said. "A daughter is loved, Bran, but an heir is a different weight in a kingdom. The succession was secure now. The line ran too deep. And I will tell you something I have never said aloud. The day Prince Joran was born was the day I became truly afraid for the first time, because I understood that everything I had watched for 6 years had been, perhaps, only preparation. A man placed in a household, patient, climbing with an unseen master. What is such a man waiting for? Not for a letter, not for a missing trinket. Those were rehearsals. He was waiting for the thing that would matter most, and now this house held the thing that would matter most. 2 children and a succession and a queen the realm loved. If you wished to break the house of Harrowgate, not to rob it but to break it, you would not strike at the stone of the walls. You would strike at what the walls were built to keep." "What did he do?" I said. My voice had dropped to match his. "Nothing," Hale said. "For a long time, nothing. That is what you must understand about a real danger as opposed to the kind in tales. It does not announce itself. It does not give you a knight of swords. It gives you years of ordinary days, and somewhere in the middle of those ordinary days, one day that is not ordinary, and you have no way of knowing in advance which day it will be. So you treat every day as though it might be the one. For 14 more years, Bran, I treated every single day as though it might be the one. Do you know what that does to a man? I said I did not. It makes him very calm on the outside, Corwin Hale said, and very tired underneath in a place the surface never shows. The steadiness you young men admire in me, the stillness, the never flinching, the thing you tell each other in the guard room, it was never serenity. It was the calm of a man holding his breath for 20 years and not letting you see his chest move. I was not at peace. I was at war quietly with one man, in a war that had no front line and no other soldiers and no end I could see. And I was winning it, day by day, in the only way such a war can be won, by being there, every day, so that the one day when it came would not find the house unwatched. He was silent a while. The clock ticked. Then he gave me the first of the close calls. The years had 3 that he counted as truly close, and the rest he called weather, and the first one I have thought about every day since. When the princess was 7, he said, she fell ill. A fever in the autumn. The court physicians came, and it was serious enough for a few days that the chapel was kept open through the nights, and the queen did not leave the child's side. You will remember nothing of this. You were a boy in a county school, but the palace remembers. We nearly lost her, Bran. And in the worst of it, when the household ran on no sleep and every door stood open for physicians and nurses coming and going at all hours, I saw the steward of the second household, my man, arrange for a particular apothecary to be admitted. A man to compound a medicine the physicians had called for. A reasonable thing. A helpful thing. Everyone was grateful for the helpful steward in a hard week. The cold in me had become a kind of stillness of my own. I did not know that apothecary, Hale said. And in 20 years of watching, the thing I had learned best was the difference between a face that belongs and a face that has been made to seem to belong. This one had been made. So I did a thing that was not my place and would have ended my service in an hour if it had gone wrong, and that I have never regretted and never told. When the medicine was compounded and set on the tray to be carried up to the princess's rooms, I was the guard on the stair, and I stopped the tray. I told the nurse in a voice that did not invite discussion that the physician-in-chief had ordered all preparations to be confirmed by his own hand before they went up, on his authority, that very hour, which was a lie, Bran, a flat lie told by a king's guard on the queen's own stair. And I carried that tray myself to the physician-in-chief, an honest old man half dead on his feet, and I asked him plainly to look at what was in the cup. And he looked. And he went gray. And he asked me very quietly where this had come from, because it was not what he had ordered, and in the quantity it held it would not have cured a fever in a 7-year-old child. It would have stopped her heart. I do not know how long I sat without breathing. The gallery, the cold stone, the long case clock, all of it had gone very far away, and there was only the old man on the bench and the thing he had just laid between us. She lived, I said. It came out almost as a plea. She lived, Corwin Hale said gently. She is upstairs asleep behind those doors tonight, 15 years old and taller than her mother, and she lived because an honest physician looked twice at a cup. And the physician looked twice at the cup because a guard carried it to him with a lie in his mouth. And the guard carried it because he had watched one man for 7 years and knew the shape of his hands in the dark. Pull any thread out of that and she does not live. That is what I meant the first night about a fire that never caught. Somewhere in this realm there are people who love that princess and pray for her and would have wept for 100 years if she had died in her 7th autumn. And not one of them will ever know how close it came, or that it came at all, or that there was a man it came past. There is no monument to it. There is only an old guard on a bench and a young one who cannot get his breath. Then you had it, I said. Then you could prove it. A poisoned cup, the physician as witness, the apothecary admitted by the steward's own hand. You could go to anyone, you could. I could prove a cup was poison, he said, and his voice was iron again. Listen to me, because this is the heart of the whole long matter, and you have just made in one breath the mistake that would have destroyed everything. I could prove the cup. I could not prove the hand. The apothecary fled that same night, vanished, never found, a false name and a false trade, gone as cleanly as the undernurse 5 years before. The steward was grief itself when the matter was looked into. He had only admitted a tradesman the physician's own office had named, he said, and the office's records, when checked, did indeed carry the name, written in a clerk's hand that no one could swear to. He had been helpful. He had been deceived by the same villains as everyone else. He wept for the princess. And the inquiry, there was an inquiry, a real one this time, because a poisoned cup is a real thing. The inquiry found a plot, yes, but it found the plot ended at the vanished apothecary, a lone madman, a fanatic against the crown, run to ground and gone. The realm was told a villain had been thwarted. Bonfires were lit for the princess's recovery. And the man who had opened the door for the villain stood in the firelight with everyone else, his face glad in exactly the right degree, and was promoted within the year. Promoted, I said, the word was ash. To the first household, said Corwin Hale. To the Queen's own household, because he had been so steady in a hard week, because he had grieved so well. He drew a long breath and let it out, and when he spoke again something had changed in his telling. The slow years were behind us now, and we had arrived at the thing that had been coming all along, and he knew it, and so by then did I. And that was the night, Bran, the night they lit the bonfires for the princess who had nearly died of a cup I carried. That was the night I understood that I would never be relieved of this watch, that there would be no day when I went to someone with proof and laid the burden down and was thanked. The proof would always vanish a step ahead of me, because that was the whole craft of the man and of whoever stood behind him. He did not leave proof. He left coincidences and grief and a helpful face. I could not end him. I could only be there every time between him and the family, forever, or until one of us died. He looked at me, and he said the thing that I have carried out of that gallery and will carry to my own grave. I decided that night that I would be there until one of us died, and I decided that if it was to be me I would make certain before I went that I had not been the only one who knew. Not for my own name. A guard's name is nothing. We are not in this for our names. But because the day I died with this secret hole inside me was the day that man would have a clear field for the first time in 20 years, and I would not leave these children to a clear field. So, he almost smiled. So when an old man's heart began to skip, this past autumn, and the surgeon used a word I did not like, I began, for the first time, to look for the right young guard to tell. I watched the third watch for a season. I watched how the young men stood when they thought no one watched them. And I chose you. The weight of that came down on me slowly, the way the cold had, and then all at once. Why me? I managed. Because 3 years ago, Corwin Hale said, I watched you turn a drunken lord away from the nursery stair at 2 in the morning when he had rank enough to have you broken for it, and you did it without raising your voice and without giving an inch, and when he threatened you, you said, I heard you, you said, my lord, the children are asleep. Not it is my orders. Not you may not pass. The children are asleep, as though that and not the rule were the whole of the reason. He nodded slowly. A man who guards a rule will trade the rule when the price is right. A man who guards a sleeping child does not trade. I needed the second kind. They are rarer than you would think. He gave me the second close call on a later night, and the third he came to last of all, and I will give them to you as he gave them to me, because they are the proof, not the legal kind which never came, but the human kind of what those 20 years were made of. The second close call came in the 11th year, and it was not a poison or a plot but a question of access, which Hale said was the true ground of the whole long war. The man steward of the Queen's household now, trusted, grey at the temples himself, a fixture, the sort of servant a court grows so used to that it stops seeing him at all, had, in his rise, accumulated keys. Real keys and the better kind. The keys of habit, of being expected, of a face that no door questions. And in the 11th year, a renovation was undertaken in the older wing. the wing that held the muniment room where the deeds and the seals and the succession papers of the house of Harrowgate were kept, and the steward had the ordering of the workmen. "Workmen come and go," Hale said. "Strangers in the palace with their tools and their dust for weeks at a time. The perfect cover. No one looks at a workman's face." And among the men he engaged for that renovation was one I did not know, who came 3 days and on the 3rd day was found by me in a passage of the old wing where no workman had any cause to be, a passage that ran behind the muniment room. He had a story. They always have a story. He had taken a wrong turning, he was lost. The palace was a maze, and so it is. I walked him back myself, courteously, and I noted that under his workman's apron he wore good boots, the boots of a man who does not labor for his bread, and that his hands had never held a tool in earnest. And the next day he did not return to the work, and the renovation went on without him, and no one but I had reason to think of him again. "What was he after?" I said. "I never learned with certainty," Hale admitted. "A seal, perhaps. A forged document is worth 100 swords if it carries the right seal, or to learn the room for a later night, or only to learn whether the room could be reached and by whom, and how watched it was. A patient enemy gathers such knowledge for years before it is used. But I will tell you what I did, because it is the only kind of victory this watch ever gave me." He held up one finger. "From that day, for 9 years, I made the old wing my own. I changed my requested postings by small degrees over months so that no one would mark the pattern until I stood the watch that covered that passage more nights than any other guard. I learned every workman's face that came after. I checked every key against the steward's lists with my own eyes, claiming a fussy old man's habit, and the young guards laughed at me for it, and I let them laugh, because a man they laugh at is a man they do not suspect of anything. And in 9 years no stranger reached that passage again. Not one. I cannot prove I stopped anything. I can only tell you that for 9 years the door that a man in good boots once tried was watched by someone who knew why, and that nothing came of any of it, and that the nothing was the whole of my work and my whole reward. I understood by now the grief in it. To labor 20 years and have your only monument be a list of things that did not happen. "The realm thinks the danger to a throne is the army at the gate," Hale said. "The roar, the siege, the moment in the songs. It is not. The army at the gate the realm can see, and what the realm can see, the realm will rise to meet. The true danger is the patient hand inside the house, the one no one sees because it has been there so long it has become part of the furniture, the trusted face, the helpful steward, the man who has grieved at every cradle and stood at every bonfire. That hand does not need a single great moment. It needs only to be inside and to wait and to be unwatched for 1 hour on the one day. I made certain it was never unwatched. That is all. That is everything." And here, near the 11th and 12th, and into the long, ordinary years that followed, the story arrived at what I have come to think of as the false dawn, the years when Corwin Hale very nearly let himself believe that the war was won. "There came a time," he said, "when I thought he had given up. Years went by, the children grew, the reign steadied, the realm prospered, and the steward did nothing I could mark. He grew old in his trusted post. He spoke of retiring to a cottage the Queen's grace had granted him for his long service. I watched a man become, to all the world and very nearly to me, exactly what he pretended to be, a faithful old servant at the close of a faithful life. And I was tired, Bran. 16 years tired. And I began to tell myself a story that I wanted very badly to be true, that the master behind him had died or lost interest or been undone by some quarrel I would never know of, that the long arm had withered, that my one man was now only an old man, and harmless, and that I might at last put the ledger down. I even began to. There was a winter I did not check the keys. There was a spring I requested an easier posting, away from the old wing, because my knees had begun to fail me on the cold stone." He stopped. The pause was the longest he had given. "And that," he said at last, "is when it nearly happened. because a watch that relaxes is no watch at all, and he had spent 16 years teaching me to relax, the way a patient man teaches anything by doing nothing for so long that doing nothing comes to feel like the truth. The third close call, the last and the worst, came in the 18th year, and Corwin Hale did not tell it to me in the gallery. He told it to me on the rampart walk above the river gate, on a raw gray morning at the very end of the old year's leave, with the wind off the water and the city spread below us under low cloud, because, he said, some things should not be told sitting down. The boy, he said, Prince Joran, he was 8 that year. There was to be a procession the autumn rite, the one where the family rides through the old town to the cathedral and back, the oldest ceremony this house keeps. You have stood it. You know the route. Down the processional way, through the press of the whole city, every face turned up to the open carriage. He gripped the cold stone of the parapet with both gloved hands. An open carriage, Bran and a city's worth of strangers, and a boy of 8 waving because his mother had told him the people loved to be waved at. The one day of the year the family is most exposed and least guardable, and I had, by then, very nearly stopped watching the steward. He was an old man counting the months to his cottage. I had let myself believe it. I waited. The wind took our breath and gave it back. 3 days before the procession, Hale said, the steward of the Queen's household, in his last great act of faithful service, took it upon himself to revise the procession order. A kindness, everyone said. He had done it for 30 years. He knew the old ways better than the young marshals. He wished to leave the ceremony perfect as his parting gift. And among his revisions was a small change to the carriages, which guards rode where, which carriage carried the children, the spacing of the escort along the route. Dull marshal's work. No one questioned the dear old steward's diagram. No one but a guard who had spent 18 years learning that the dear old steward's small changes were never small, and who, that one morning 3 days out, made himself look at the diagram the way he had not let himself look at anything in 2 years, the old way. The cold way. The way that had read a seating chart in the second winter of the reign. What did you see? A gap, Corwin Hale said. 1 carriage length of the route, on the sharp turn by the old cloth market where the procession must slow almost to a stop, and the crowd presses closest, 1 carriage length where, by his diagram, the children's carriage would for perhaps 30 seconds be screened from the nearest mounted guard by the bulk of the carriage ahead, on the blind side in the densest press at the slowest point. 30 seconds. A nothing. A spacing error any tired marshal might make. Except that I had spent 18 years learning that this man did not make errors. He made opportunities and dressed them as errors, and then grieved beautifully when they were taken. 30 seconds on the blind side, at the slowest, densest point of the one day, the family could not be locked behind doors. I did not know what was meant to come into those 30 seconds. I have never known. I knew only that they had been made deliberately by a hand I had watched for 18 years, and that they must not exist. The gray river ran below us. I found my own hands had gripped the parapet as his had. I could not raise an alarm, he said. 3 days out, on the word of an old guard's eye, against the beloved steward's parting gift, with no proof but a spacing on a diagram that any marshal would call ordinary, you know by now what would have happened. I would have been the obsessive at last, and worse, I would have shown my hand at the one moment it must not be shown, and they would have learned, finally, that they had been watched for 18 years, and they would have simply waited for a better day, with me retired or disgraced or dead, and the children no safer for any of it. So I did not raise an alarm. He turned to me, and the wind whipped his gray hair, and his old eyes were as steady as they had been the first night. I closed the gap myself. How? I requested the mounted post beside the children's carriage. It was not my post by right. I was too old for it, and a younger man had it, and there were 3 days of quiet argument I will not bore you with, a favor called in, a captain reminded of a thing he owed me, an old sergeant's stubbornness that the young marshals gave way to rather than fight. And on the day of the procession, when the carriages reached the sharp turn by the old cloth market and slowed almost to a stop in the densest press of the whole route, there was a guard on the blind side where the diagram had promised none, an old guard, on a borrowed horse his knees could barely manage, in his place by no order any clerk had written, watching the crowd on the side no one was meant to watch. And nothing happened. The 30 seconds passed. The crowd cheered. The boy waved. The carriage rolled on to the cathedral, and the family heard the bells rung for them, and came home, and never knew there had been a turn in the road where, for a little while, on a gray afternoon, everything had hung on whether one tired old man had remembered how to look at a diagram the cold way. He let go of the parapet. "That is the third one," he said. "Those are the 3 I count. There were others I half saw and turned aside without ever being sure they were real." He drew his coat closer against the wind off the river. "But there is one thing more I must give you, and it is the heaviest, and it is not a danger at all." He said little more that morning on the rampart. The wind had got into his chest, and he coughed in a way I did not like, and we went down off the wall. But he came to me once more, a week later in the guardroom when it was empty, and he told me the thing that was not a close call at all, and that he said mattered more than any of the 3, because it was the cost, and he wanted me to have weighed the cost before I took up the post, so that I went into it with my eyes open and not in the heat of a tale. "You will want to know," he said, "what it does to the rest of a man's life, to stand a watch no one knows you stand. I will tell you because no one told me, and I would have stood it better if they had." He turned his cap slowly in his hands. "It makes you a stranger in your own house. My Alina and I were married 22 years, and for the last 16 of them there was a room in me she was never let into, and she felt the door of it though she never found it, and she grew quiet with me in a way that I told myself was only the quiet of long marriage and was not. I could not tell her. The whole craft of it was that no one could be told. So I let my own wife believe some nights that the distance in me was coldness or weariness of her, or the dull settling of a man into his middle years. Anything but the truth, which was that I lay beside her running through a steward's day in my head, his keys, his letters, the faces he favored while she thought I slept. She died not knowing the best thing I ever did. That is the price, Bran, not the danger. The danger is almost a mercy. It gives you something to do. The price is the years of ordinary life you give up living, because half of you is always standing at a door, and the people who love you spend their love on the half of you that is left, and never know there was a better half kept back on guard." He looked at me steadily. "If you take this, you take that too. Be sure you are willing to be misunderstood by the people closest to you for the whole of your life, and to die without ever setting it right, because that is what the watch costs, and there is no version of it that costs less. I will not pretend to you that it is only honor. It is honor, but it is paid for in a coin that does not show." I have thought about that more, since, than almost anything he told me. The poisoned cup is the part of the story the realm can hold. But the part he wanted me to keep was the room his wife was never let into, and the love she spent on the half of him that was free. And I think that is the truest measure of what a man like that gives, and the one no memorial will ever carve, because it cannot be carved. "There were 10,000 ordinary days," he went on, when he came back to it that last week, "between the 3 I count and the nothing was the victory every single day, though no bell ever rang for it. 18 years, Bran, to that procession. 2 more since. 20 in all. And in 20 years not one soul in this realm knew that anything was being kept from the door. Not the queen, not the children, not my own dead wife. Not one man in the guardroom who called me steady, and never asked what the steadiness was made of. Until you. Until 3 nights ago, when my heart skipped on the amber stair, and I decided that 20 years was long enough to carry a thing alone. I asked him then, the question I had been afraid to ask since the first night. And the steward, the man, he is still here." "He is still here," Corwin Hale said. He retires in the spring to his cottage with the Queen's grace and a pension and the love of a household he has served, by their reckoning, with perfect faith for 24 years. He will die an honored old man in a warm cottage the crown gave him, and be buried with kind words, and no one will ever know. Unless, he looked at me, unless the man who knew chose at the very end to do a thing he had never once let himself do in 20 years, which is to speak. I understood, on the cold rampart above the river, why he had chosen a guard and not a captain, a young man and not a court. He had not given me his story to comfort an old man's last winter. He had given it to me because a thing is heavier in 2 hands than in 1, and because he meant to lay it down at last, properly, before the whole house. And he could not be the only one who knew when he did it, or it would die with him in the dismissing of it. He needed a witness who had heard it whole from his own mouth while he lived. He needed me so that when he spoke, there would be a second voice in the room that could say, "I heard this from him before he had anything to gain by it, and I believe him." "You mean to tell the Queen?" I said. "I mean to tell the Queen," said Corwin Hale, "what I should perhaps have told her 20 years ago and did not, for all the reasons I have given you, which were good reasons, and which I have weighed every day of 20 years and would weigh the same way again. But the calculation has changed, Bran. For 20 years my silence was the wall between that man and the family, because my silence kept me watched over and unsuspected and in place. Now I am dying. My silence is about to become his opportunity. The wall is coming down whether I will it or not. The only question left to me is whether it comes down as my death, leaving him a clear field, or as my last act, leaving the field watched. I have decided it will be my last act, and I will need you to stand beside me when I do it, and to keep watching him after I am gone, because the watch does not end with the man who kept it. That is the other thing I am giving you. Not only the story, the post. We told her on the eve of the Epiphany, in the small audience room with the green hangings, with the Prince Consort Aldrich beside her, and the chamberlain summoned, and the captain of the bodyguard standing white-faced by the door. I will not pretend I was not afraid. To stand before the Queen of Eldermoor and accuse, by the mouth of a dying guard, the most trusted servant of her household, a man she had known and relied upon for the whole of her reign, is a thing that could have ended both our lives in disgrace within the hour, and very nearly did in the first minutes before she heard us out. For Corwin Hale did not soften it. He stood, he would not sit, though she bade him twice, and he laid it before her exactly as he had laid it before me, in the plain order of the years, the seating chart and the false letter and the undernurse, and the cup the physician went gray over, and the man in good boots behind the muniment room, and the gap in the procession order by the old cloth market. He named no proof because he had none, and he said so plainly at the start before she could say it for him. Majesty, I can prove not one word of this. If I could have proved it, I would have brought it to a court, not to you. I bring you instead 20 years of a watch I kept without leave and without telling you, and I ask you to weigh it against the faith you have placed in the man it concerns. And I know what I am asking, and I know what it costs you to hear it, and I would not ask it if I were not dying and unable to stand between him and your children 1 season longer. There was a silence in that green room I have never heard the like of, before or since. The chamberlain spoke first, and it was very nearly the end of us. He was not a wicked man, I want that understood. He was a careful man doing his office, and his office was to protect the Queen from exactly this. An old guard, ailing, his mind perhaps going with his heart, breaking 20 years of silence to accuse a faithful servant of an unprovable phantom plot. He said as much, gently, terribly, reasonably. He said that grief and illness and the long strain of the watch could turn a good man's vigilance into a kind of waking dream, in which every coincidence becomes a conspiracy. He said that the steward had served the crown with documented faithfulness for 24 years. He said that if every unexplained coincidence in a great household were treated as the work of a hidden hand, no servant could ever be trusted and no court could ever function. He said, in short, everything that Corwin Hale had told me, On the first night, the world would say, had said it himself, in fact, when he chose his silence. And hearing it now in the chamberlain's mouth, I felt the whole 20 years tilting toward the abyss of being, simply, not believed. And then the Queen spoke. She had not taken her eyes from Corwin Hale through the whole of it. Queen Saralind of Eldermoor, and I had stood near her 100 times and thought I knew her bearing. And I knew nothing, looked at the old guard for a long moment after the chamberlain had finished. And then she asked him one question, and it was not the question I expected, and it was not the question the chamberlain expected, and it was, I have come to believe, the wisest question I have ever heard a ruler ask. She did not ask, can you prove it? She did not ask, why did you wait? She looked at the old man swaying on his failing legs in front of her throne, and she said, very quietly, Sergeant Hale, in 20 years, what did this cost you, and what did you ask for it? And Corwin Hale, who had stood unmoved through the chamberlain's dismantling of his life's work, who had not flinched at being called a dreamer to the Queen's face, Corwin Hale's composure broke, at last on that question, the way stone breaks, all at once, and along a line that had been there unseen the whole time. Nothing, Majesty, he said. His voice was not steady now. I asked for nothing. There was no one to ask. A thing prevented leaves no mark. He gathered himself. It cost me my sleep and my wife's peace, though she never knew the cause, and 20 years of standing between your family and a thing I could not prove and could not name and could not lay down. I did not want it. I prayed some years to be proven a fool so that I might put it down and rest. I was never proven a fool, so I never put it down. And I ask for nothing now except that you do not let it die with me, because the day it dies with me is the day the door stands open. That is all. That is everything I came to say. The Queen of Eldermoor rose from her chair. She did not look at the chamberlain. She crossed the green room to where the old guard stood swaying, and I can hardly write it even now. She took the old man's gloved hands in both of her own, the hands that had carried a poisoned cup and closed a gap in a procession, and checked 1,000 keys against a list while young men laughed, and she held them and she said, I believe you, Sergeant Hale. The chamberlain began to speak again, Majesty, with respect, there is no proof. And she stopped him with a lifted hand without turning, her eyes still on the old guard. There is no proof, she said. I have heard, and I have served as your sovereign long enough to know the difference, my Lord Chamberlain, between a man who comes to me for something and a man who comes to me for nothing. Every accusation I have heard in this room across all the years of my reign came wrapped around a want, a rival to be pulled down, a place to be gained, a grudge to be paid. This is the first I have ever heard that asked for nothing at all. A man does not carry an unprovable thing for 20 years, telling no one, gaining nothing, ruining his own sleep and his own name's chance of glory to spend it at last on a lie. There is no profit in this lie. There is no profit in it anywhere. That is why I believe it, and that is why we will not dismiss it. We will quietly, carefully, and without alarming the household, find out whether the old guard who never asked for anything was right. What followed, I learned only in pieces, for it was done as quietly as the Queen had promised. She did not have the steward arrested. An arrest needs proof, and there was none, and an arrest would have warned whoever stood behind him, for she had grasped, as quickly as Hale himself, that the steward was the near end of a longer arm. Instead, she did what Corwin Hale had never been able to do because she alone had the power to do it. She set a watch of her own with the resources of a crown behind it on the man Hale had watched alone for 20 years. Not a guard's watch now. The Queen's watch. The captain of the bodyguard sworn to silence, 2 trusted men of the household, a discreet examination of 24 years of the steward's correspondence, his accounts, the names he had recommended, the keys he had held, the changes he had made to seating and procession and staff. All of it laid, at last, beside the ledger Corwin Hale had carried in his head, and now, in his last winter, set down on paper for them. And the ledger held. I do not mean that they found a confession, or a master's name, or the great proof that 20 years had never yielded. They did not. The man behind the steward, if one man it was never found, and the steward, when at last he understood he was watched, gave them nothing. He was too old and too practiced for that, and he died, that spring, in his crown-given cottage of his own failing heart, without ever once admitting to a single word. The arm was never traced to its shoulder. In that, the story does not end the way the tales end, with the villain in chains and his master named in open court. But laid side by side, the seating chart, the false letter from a family that never knew his name, the undernurse who fled and the letter that vanished with her, the apothecary admitted by his hand and the cup that would have stopped a child's heart, the man in good boots behind the muniment room, the gap by the old cloth market that any marshal would call ordinary, and that fell on the blind side at the slowest point on the one day the family rode open through the city, laid side by side, 20 years deep. The coincidences stopped being coincidences. No single one was proof. All of them together were a pattern, and a pattern is a kind of truth even when no court can hang a man on it. The Queen looked at the whole of it, the shape of a long invisible threat surfacing at last like a wreck from a draining lake, and she understood, the realm understood, when it came in time to know, what 20 years of one guard's quiet stubbornness had truly meant. Not 3 close calls thwarted. A door held shut for 20 years against a hand that had only ever needed it open for 1 hour on one day, and had never once in all that time found it unwatched. The steward retired to his cottage in the spring as planned, for there was no charge to hold him on. But he retired watched, and he died watched, and whatever he had waited 20 years to do, he died without the clear field he had been promised by the slow arithmetic of an old guard's failing heart. Corwin Hale had been right about that too. The day the secret would have died with him would have been the steward's day. Instead, the secret outlived the old guard, and so the watch outlived him, and the door stayed shut. For Corwin Hale did not see the spring. His heart, which had carried that 20-year watch the way a man carries a weight that is just slightly too heavy for too many years, gave way in the last week of February, in his own bed in the guard's quarters, in the small gray hours when he had stood so many watches. I was with him. He had asked for me, and they had sent for me, and I came off my post in the night and sat with him as he had once made me sit with him on the cold bench beneath the third king's portrait. He was not afraid. I have seen men afraid at the end, and he was not. He was, if anything, lighter than I had ever known him, as though the weight he had carried for 20 years had finally been set into other hands, and his own, empty at last, could rest. "Is it shut?" he asked me near the end. "The door?" "It is shut, Sergeant," I told him. "It is watched. The Queen knows, I know, it will not stand unwatched." He nodded slowly against the pillow. "That is all it ever was," he murmured, "standing where the door is. Anyone could have done it, it only wanted doing." And then, after a while, so quietly I had to lean close, "Tell the young ones, Bran, when they call a man steady, tell them they do not know what the steadiness is made of. Tell them it is not nothing, the standing still. It is not nothing." He died near dawn. The bell that is rung for a guardsman of long service rang out over the river as the sky grayed, and I stood at my post that morning with my eyes forward and the cold on my face, and I let no one see that I was weeping, because he would not have wished it seen, and because I had learned from him that a guard's grief, like a guard's watch, is a thing held quietly and shown to no one. But here is the part that he did not live to know, and that I think would have troubled him more than it would have pleased him, for he had spent 20 years making certain it would never come. The realm found out. The Queen would not let it be otherwise. She said, I was told she said it to the Chamberlain, the same careful man, who by then had come to understand what he had nearly dismissed, and was the first to bow his head over it. She said that a man could not be allowed to give 20 years to the keeping of her children, and go into the ground with no one but a dying bed witness to know it. She said that the very thing that made his service great, that it left no mark, asked no thanks, sought no name, was the very thing that obliged her to give it the mark and the thanks and the name herself, since he never would. He guarded us from the dark, she said, "and the wage of guarding from the dark is that no one ever sees the dark you turned aside. I will see it. I will make the realm see it. That is the only payment I can make to a man who never asked for one, and I will not be too proud or too cautious to make it." So at the spring memorial, with the whole household gathered, and the children of the house of Harrowgate standing grave and bareheaded in the cold cathedral, where a procession had once passed safely through a gap that should not have existed, the Queen of Eldermoor rose and told them. Not all of it, not the steward's name, for the dead deserved their silence too, and there was never proof to break it with, and she was just to the end. But she told them that for 20 years, unknown to her household, unknown even to the man's own wife, one guard of her family had carried a vigil against a danger that only he had seen, that he had asked for nothing, taken no credit, sought no advancement, and stood between her children and the dark through 20 winters of silence. And that the family of Harrowgate and the realm of Eldermoor owed him a debt that could never be named in full because the very nature of his gift was that its cost was invisible. And then she did the thing that I think moved the cathedral more than any words. She did not speak of his rank, or his medals, or his long record. She said only that he had once turned a powerful man from a nursery stair in the small hours with the words, "The children are asleep," and that those 4 words were, in the end, the whole of his creed and his whole reward. That the children slept, and never knew and were safe, and never knew that either. Prince Joran, who is 10 now and grave beyond his years, asked afterward to see the place where the old guard had stood his watches. They took him to the long gallery, to the stone bench beneath the 3rd king's portrait, and he sat on it a while, the boy whose carriage had rolled unharmed through a gap by the old cloth market when he was 8 and waving, and then he stood and squared his small shoulders the way he had seen the guards square theirs, and he said good morning to the empty post by name, the way he had always said it, and then he understood that there was no one there to answer, and he was quiet. I stand that post now. The Queen, who keeps her promises, gave it to me, and gave me also the other thing that cannot be written in any order of duty, the post that has no name, the one inside the head, the watch on a door that may already be shut and may not, on an arm whose shoulder was never found, on the chance that 20 years was a beginning and not an end. I check the keys against the lists. The young guards laugh at the fussy habit, and I let them laugh, because a man they laugh at is a man they do not suspect of anything, and because I learned that too from him. I have thought a great deal in the cold hours about what his 20 years meant, and I have come to this. We honor the guard who stands his ground against the storm. Everyone can see the provoker in his face, the blow taken, the line held in front of a crowd that gasps and films and remembers, and rightly. But there is another kind of guarding, harder and lonelier and never seen, and it is the one Corwin Hale gave his life to stand against the storm that no one else can see, for so long that you half doubt it yourself, and to ask for nothing, and to take no credit, and to know that if you do your work perfectly, the whole world will be certain that nothing ever happened because nothing did, because you were there. A fire put out is a story. A fire that never caught is nothing at all. He spent 20 years making nothing happen, and the nothing was the greatest thing any man in this house has ever done. He told me the first night that I would decide for myself after whether an old guard had kept faith or only kept a secret. I have decided. He kept faith. He kept it longer and quieter and at greater cost than the realm will ever fully grasp, and he kept it for 2 sleeping children who will live their whole lives never knowing how near the dark once came, which is exactly how he wanted it, and exactly why it was faith and not a secret. A secret is kept for yourself. A vigil is kept for someone else. His was a vigil. I stand his post now, beneath the 3rd king's portrait, with my eyes forward and the doors to the royal apartments at the end of the gallery, where behind a foot of oak the family of Harrowgate sleeps. The clock ticks at the stairhead. The river runs black past the Watergate, and I watch the doors the way he taught me to watch them, not the way you watch an empty thing, but the way you watch a thing that has tried before to come through and may try again, and must not find the door unwatched. The children are asleep. That is the whole of the reason. It always was.